All right, I hope everyone had a great long weekend. In this video, we're going to be reviewing all the different ways of solving quadratic equations. So we're going to go over each method and then kind of talk about the advantages and disadvantages and when it can and can't be used. So the first method is factoring and using the zero product property. And this was actually in lessons 7, 5, and 7, 8 when we did our factoring chapter. So an example here is a trinomial that we can really easily factor. And then we get the two answers using that zero product property of -2 and -3. So an advantage to this method is that it's very simple and straightforward and easy when the trinomial can be factored. The disadvantage is that not all trinomials can be factored. We had prime ones, and so you wouldn't be able to use this method if the trinomial's not factorable. Okay. The second method is graphing. So this method we did in lesson 9.2, and we graphed and then found the x-intercepts. So the advantage to this is that you can visualize the answer. This method is really nice, especially when you have a graphing calculator or you're using Desmos. The disadvantage is that it may not give exact answers. So if you look at your graph and you can't tell what the x-intercepts are, because they're in between, there's some fraction or decimal, that's kind of a disadvantage to this method. And even your graphing calculator might not give you the exact answer if it has to be a decimal that's rounded. So graphing is another method, but it might not always be the best if you're doing it by hand or if you're not able to get exact answers. The third method is using square roots. We did this in section 9.3. So I drew out two examples. If you have like x squared equals 36, you take the square root of both sides to get plus or minus 6. Something like this, we take the square root of both sides, take away 2 from both sides, and then we get two answers of 0 and -4. So this method of just kind of taking the square root of both sides is great if the equation is set up this way. Not all equations are set up this way. Like we wouldn't be able to do that for the trinomial in example 1. But if it's kind of set up in a format where we can take the square root of both sides, that's a great method to use. And again, the disadvantage is it can only be used for certain equations. All right, we got two more. The second to last one is completing the square. And so this was, again, where we took that b value, let's make that thinner. We took the b value, we cut it in half, and we squared it. And then we were able to kind of follow up with taking square roots of both sides. So this method can always be used, but it's best when the a value is 1 and b is even, right? If we're dividing by 2, it's nicest if that b is even. So when you divide by 2, we get a whole number. Otherwise, we had those fractions or decimals to deal with. And kind of the disadvantage is that it may involve some difficult calculations. So if a is not 1 and b is not even, you might get into a little bit more difficult calculations to deal with. All right, and then the last method is the quadratic formula. So again, for review, this is that x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The nice thing about this one is it can be used for any equation. So like factoring, it has to be factorable. Graphing, you might get decimal answers. For square roots, it has to be in that format where you can take the square root of both sides. But the quadratic formula can be used for any quadratic equation, and that's really the advantage to it. The disadvantage is it does take some time to kind of substitute everything in and to do all the calculations. So certainly depending on the setup of the problem or the situation, each of these methods has its time and place to be used. And so this lesson is just kind of an overview of all 5 different methods and then kind of when they're best to use or not to use. So your homework is to look at all the problems that I'm assigning and look at it and say, based on this setup, what is the most efficient method? So I really like for you to use a variety of methods in your homework. Don't just do the quadratic formula every single time, but pick a method that's kind of most efficient and try to use some variety and explain why you're choosing that method over a different one. All right, that's all for today. Please message me if you have any questions, and we will be doing some more review of Chapter 9 tomorrow.